Well, welcome. The silly season for the state is finally behind us, and the rumor was that Jennifer's put John outside, got covered with snow, and we had to wait till we got some temperature, but John is here. Let's start with an introduction.
Good evening, Al. John Fernandes, State Representative, Town of Milford, Mendon, Hopedale, and a part of Medway.
And one street in Medway.
Which means all of Medway. I was at an interboard meeting the other day down in Medway, and they said, John, you represent 25% of Medway. I said, no, I get voted by 25% of Medway. I represent all of Medway, because that's the way it works.
I always thought that'd be a good deal. Could we trade one or two streets and
Yeah.
get like 3 representatives?
Yeah, there you go.
Then we'd have 3 people having to fight for us.
Well, actually, that's one of the things people talk about it. Is it better to have, is it worse having split communities? And I found it, well, I mean, when I first came in, I didn't have Medway. Carolyn Dykema had the precinct that I had, or I have now, but Jimmy Valley was the rep. Jimmy was a 18-year veteran.
I was going to say, that's not bad to have that guy on your...
So you've got Jimmy and another rep, and Jimmy helps to train that rep, and that helps. So you got 2 voices, and when there's a changeover, you don't lose that sense of institutional knowledge and advocacy. And when I took over that precinct, Jeff Roy came in as a freshman rep, and we've been able to work well together, and I've been able to help him get up to speed in terms of how to do that advocacy. So I think in some ways there's a benefit to having the split in the community, or at least it's not a detriment.
Well, I mean, the mentorship I can see.
Yeah.
But I absolutely, what you just said, 2 voices.
Yeah.
The fact is, like you said, you can't advocate for East Medway or West Medway. You have to go fight for Medway.
No, somebody calls, I don't ask, do you live in this part of
town?
Do
you vote in Precinct 5?
Or when I get called by the town about an issue, I don't say, well, how's this going to affect Precinct 1? The interboard meeting was about all the issues affecting Medway, and that's what happens. In fact, for the legislator, we're all supposed to represent 42,000 people, so 2,000 of those people are in Precinct 1 in Medway, but in fact, I pick up 8,000 because I'm really representing that whole community. So it's more work for the legislator to have the split of a number of towns because you own all of that town.
Well, the other thing in the whole Rhode Island complex of, you're never going to split a big state. So you're never going to split, a big town.
Yeah.
So when you look at a small town.
Yeah, we've got to get the one man, one vote concept, one person, one vote. So, everybody's got to have approximately 42,000 people. The only way to do that in some cases is to split up communities.
But I can see where a small town like a Medway, they won't have the clout or whatever of a Milford, Franklin, Worcester. So having 2 reps kind of helps them out a little bit because it gives them a little more say.
Well, it can be helpful. Before Carolyn Dykema took Precinct 1, there was a Republican that had that Hopkinton Holliston seat, and he worked very well with Jimmy Valley, and so you had both a Republican and Democratic voice in there. So regardless of who was in control of the executive lever, they had a person in there who had a voice inside that administration. So
yeah, but that's going to be hard. How do you spread out 12 people?
Yeah, well, it worked for that. But actually, it's a rising population, 35, I think now. So.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, there's a rationale behind the strategy to increase the numbers, but.
Well, but realistically, I think you're starting. At least I'm feeling a lot more people falling like I do, where you look to the side and you say, "Am I blue enough to be a Democrat?" No. You're too physically conservative. Okay. Am I red enough to be a Republican? No. Yeah, the social issues. You won't draw hard and fast lines. So we're back to Holy Cross purple, somewhere in between. And I keep seeing more and more of the population in that unregistered or whatever.
Unenrolled.
Unenrolled.
What we used to call independent.
Yes, you can't do that anymore.
But now there's an independent party, so we can't call it that.
But is the battle not for the unenrolled?
It always is, absolutely. I've always looked at the state representative race as essentially a larger local race. It's not so much about the party you're in as it is who you are, what you represent, what your philosophy is, what your politics is. how well you can connect with people within the community, deliver constituent services. And then, obviously, no one is ever going to agree with all of the votes any of us take all of the time. You serve on the Finance Committee. There are votes you're going to take that people are going to disagree with. The concept is, can any of us explain the votes that others disagree with in a rational way so that somebody at least respects the judgment process and the ultimate judgment that was made? And if too many of those happen, well, then you're going to vote some other way. Because even though you appreciate and respect the person's working hard and exercising their judgment in the way they see it, if that happens too often, you're going to say, well, you really don't represent me anymore on issues, and I'm going to have to go a different direction. We see that happen, but I was feeling pretty good about the consequences of the last election. So.
I would hope so.
Yeah, no, it was a good turn. It was a good result for a tough election. So.
Why was it a tough election?
Well, from my perspective, I was fighting two fights in an election, which is a new phenomena at a representatives level. I had a candidate who was campaigning, and I would normally meet that candidate head on, and I did, whether it was in forums or on the street.
Being caddy, were you really fighting the candidate, or were you fighting
Well,
a party?
I had that. I'm always fighting a candidate. I'm always competing with somebody who's in an election. But in that particular election, we saw for the first time in Massachusetts that I'm aware of the level of PAC money coming in to support candidates to the tune of, tens upon tens upon tens upon thousands of dollars in targeted races. They targeted this particular there were actually 3 or 4 organizations, conservative organizations, that collaborated at least tangentially, I would say, to target approximately 20 races. And those races, interestingly enough, sort of wove up the 495 belt in some ways, targeting, I don't think intentionally targeting moderate Democrats, but coincidentally targeting moderate Democrats because they were looking at what they could exaggerate as strident votes that would upset a conservatively moderate population, which I have and I represent. And well, you can't go into a conservative Democrats district and attack that because they probably didn't vote that way. And you can't go into a really very liberal Democrats district and attack that because the population wants the person to vote that way. So the consequence is that the targeted reps were all fairly moderate Democrats who were, at least in their opinions, susceptible to taking certain votes, moving them out of context in a way that would make them appear to be much more liberal than they actually were, or misrepresenting them altogether, to upset the moderate to conservative voter.
I guess, when Ryan Fatman came out, I asked him point blank. I got a bunch of poo put in my mailbox. Because when I looked at the mailer, it was pure, unadulterated horse poo. And I said, did you have anything to do with it? Well, no. Okay, so it's not you as a Republican doing it. Who's doing it? Because personally, it annoys me when somebody who's not from Milford tries to come in and tell me what's good for Milford. But it seemed to have worked. And if it wasn't the candidate, who's doing it?
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't work as well as people would like it to. You can move close elections with that kind of stuff. You can move 5% of the vote.
Okay.
Maybe 8% of the vote. It's more effective on a statewide or national level because there's less personal connection between the candidate and the individual. So when you're trying to define the individual to people who don't really know the person other than what they see through the media, then that kind of stuff can have a pretty serious impact. But you can't put out literature that says John Fernandes is anti-veteran. It's just not going to work with the veterans that I know within the community who know what I do.
Well, I remember when I saw that, I laughed. I said, now, if you really were against the veterans, would John Pillar be standing side by side?
Along with a whole bunch of other.
But I'm just saying, here's the veterans rep.
Yeah.
If anybody knows who's the friend of the veterans and who isn't, it's going to be John.
But they take these votes out of context, turn them around as to their meaning, and you know, you're always playing a game of gotcha in campaigns, particularly short campaigns. And so the point is, in terms of effectiveness, there were 20 reps they targeted. Only 2 of those reps lost. The winning margins were generally in the 15 to 25% range. So maybe my vote might have been 5% greater or 6% greater without that campaign, but you've got to have a close election for that kind of thing to have an effect.
No, that makes more sense, because there's going to be people, and I can see it on a state level. I don't really know the state rep, so I read about them. Or I don't know the state senator, I read about her, but I don't know her. It's got to be a lot harder to read something and say, yeah, John's not perfect, but he wouldn't do this.
Well, and more importantly, when you're in a campaign and you're knocking on doors or you're appearing at events, people aren't shy to say, hey, you know, the particular mailer we were just talking about, you know, they managed to put it out right around, I forget what the holiday, maybe it was 9/11, that's when it was. It was around 9/11, so there were 9/11 ceremonies going on. So I show up at the senior center, and a woman I've known has voted for me for 40 years that I've been in office, comes up to me and points a finger in my face and says, I got a question for you. And the guy next to her says, oh, you're not gonna like this. I said, oh no, I know what's coming. Well, within a 5-minute conversation, she was turned back around and okay about it. But you know, what was most difficult coming out of that conversation was the realization that particularly older folks who have respect for what they read, you know, she said to me, well, they can lie in that stuff?
Yeah.
You know, it's like there should be some law against
This is
it.
a fact, right?
Yeah.
There's a fact checker before they print it?
Yeah, that stuff's not happening. So as long as in a local race, if you're doing what we do, which is you're in touch with people, they know you, and during a campaign you're getting out and meeting people and you can address these things, not just in the literature you send out, but in the face-to-face meetings, then the numbers would show us that alone shouldn't bring a candidate down.
No, I can see, I never really understood it, but what you're saying, can it affect 3, 5, 8%?
Yeah.
I could see it.
It's how many numbers, it will turn, because look, I got 42,000 people who vote for me. I mean, 42,000 people I represent, 27,000.
I was going to say, if 42,000 vote for you, you're doing good.
No, 42,000 I represent, 27,000 that can vote, and maybe 14, 15,000 that are going to come out and vote. I know thousands of people in this community on a personal level, and in this region, I don't know 15, 16, 18,000 of them. So you can get to some people. It just puts the burden on me as a candidate or any other candidate to make sure you're doing what you're supposed to do in a campaign, which is get out. And you know, people don't necessarily see, you know, a 60-40 win like I got as huge, but my view of campaigns is anybody who puts their name on the ballot ought to be getting 30 to 35% of the vote. So if I start with 35%, my opponent starts with 35%, what are we fighting for? The 30 in the middle. If I win 60-40, I've gone better than 2-1 in the middle. That shows that the middle, the people that you're looking to try and get your hands on to vote for you, when they're breaking 2-1 in your favor, the campaign's been successful. The campaign's been successful.
Well, you know, you hear that you can win an election on one of two things, either energy and personality or a machine. You know, we've had elections where the candidate, we didn't even see him.
Mm-hmm.
But the machine was strong enough that, you know, stay home, don't say anything, don't screw it up. We've had a campaign recently where you had a candidate out there at every door, at every minute, everywhere. I mean, is that fact? I mean, is it one of two ways, or is it a mixture?
I think the first way is less effective today than it used to be, and that's somewhat what you saw in those 20 races. There was a distant machine that was putting out all this literature, writing it all, organizing this stuff, raising the money and sending out these flyers into my district that looked the exact same in the next district, that looked the exact same in the next district, spending, you know, probably, I don't know, more, at least $500,000, if not more.
Really?
Collectively across those 20 races, probably more, with the other organizations that were doing it.
A representative race.
Not just in my race.
No,
I'm
no,
saying
but
across
a
races.
representative race. What does that typically cost?
Well, in my race, and I ran hard, I spent over $60,000 on my campaign. And remember, I didn't have a primary. When I ran in 2006, between the primary and the general, I spent close to $100,000. Now, a lot of people will tell you they don't do those numbers. They do 20,000, they do 30.
But John, if you divvy up
Yeah.
and you say, I'm spending $500,000-$600,000 on 20 races, that's a lot of money. I mean, that's statistically relevant.
That's not
Per
the candidate.
race.
The
No.
candidate's raising their own money and spending their own money. This is an out-of-district group that's targeted 20 races that says, we're going to send the literature out.
Right, but if
And
you're
we will
raising
do the
60 and they're putting in 20 against,
Or 50.
or whatever it is, but 20, 30,000 minimum,
Yeah.
that's a pretty significant amount of money being thrown.
It is, because also they're getting rates that are a lot better when they do the mass mailings, that they're sending the same thing, change the picture, send the same.
It's like the
you know.
encyclopedia, dear Mrs.
Yeah,
Insert name
yeah,
here.
insert name. But look, I'm not complaining about that. It is what it is. But the more we lose local control of elections, look, I'm on the backside of my political career. So as this stuff matures, do we really want to lose local control of local elections? Because that's the danger in this kind of thing. They will tell you, hey, the unions and the advocacy groups have been doing this for years. I think one union sent out one piece of mail on my behalf. And if I knew they were going to do it, I would have asked them not to, because I don't think union flyers or advocacy flyers are as effective as personal campaigning and stuff coming from me.
Sure.
But when an organization sends out stuff the way it was done, I don't think that's as effective today. Again, it can move 4, 5, 6% of the vote, but it's not going to. If you're a solid candidate in your own district, then you should be fine with that. I do think historically, over my time in office and proven again and again, is the candidate who's willing to go out and knock on the doors and spend the time meeting people is going to have a strong edge at the end of the day.
Well, it seems that way because, you look at the other race and there was energy.
People want to be asked.
Exactly. I mean, it's hard when somebody looks in and says, would you vote for me? When you say yes, even though they say you go into the voter's booth and you still got that guilt. You promised.
Yeah, but you need a touch of both. I mean, a lot of people, and I can't thank people enough, who continue to come out to support me as volunteers election after election, and the energy that people bring, the willingness to go out and hold a sign on a cold day or donate money that, you wonder, do you really have the ability to do this? But, if they can't do this, they do a couple of bucks here or whatever.
Yeah, but that's personal.
Making phone calls, sending out
I mean,
cards.
writing a check because I'm a lifelong Democrat or a lifelong Republican, yeah. But standing out in the cold,
That's personal.
that's not about red or blue party.
No,
That's got to be you
personal.
believe in.
And I'm extremely grateful for the people who have, year after year and time after time and election after election, been willing to come out and do
So
that.
now we roll into
Yeah.
the meat of it, budget.
We're here.
We're all waiting, and everything we hear is less than exciting. I'm not hearing we got lots of money and not enough places to spend it.
No, I love the comment that we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. What I've tried to say to people is, it's not so much we have a spending problem because we only spend what we raise. Constitutionally, the Commonwealth has to have a balanced budget. So we only spend what we raise. What we have is a demand problem. We have demands that have been pent up over the recession, cutbacks that occurred, real cuts in services that occurred, and every silo of government out there, whether it's transportation or all the services or public safety, education, local services, DCF, you name it, health and human services, every one of those silos has demands that collectively far outstrip our ability to deliver revenue to them. And even though we're in a growing economy again, the demand is outpacing the revenue. So the question is, which of those priorities We pile priority on top of priority on top of priority in every one of those silos. And you've got to sort them through and pick which ones are right. So when the governor says, you know, the new governor, Governor Baker, who I look forward to working with, says we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Well, what we really have is a priority problem. You see priorities differently than the former administration saw priorities. You and I may share 90% of the priorities out there, and we may in fact have no choice because they're fixed costs we have to meet. And the argument really becomes, how do we handle that last 10 or 15%?
But I like the fact I'm not hearing the new administration say it's all the old guy's fault.
No, there have been a few
A couple
pointed
little
comments
snippies, a
about
couple-
that, but no, but when you say it's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem, I think the implication of that is you guys have been spending the money wrongly, and we're going to change that. And so you see the governor's budget that comes out, and we give him extra time as the first time
You get the
he's in
extra
as governor.
month.
You got the extra month. You see his budget come out with some different priorities. So there were winners and losers. And I didn't spend the first 5 days after he put that budget out talking to the winners. Those weren't the people contacting me.
No.
The people contacting me were the losers in that priority
What's the big
budget.
shift that you see?
Well, there's a shift in thinking. He's looked at some things and suggested that, for instance, certain grant monies that go into education, rather than having individual grant programs put it all in a pot of money, well, that pot of money is going to be smaller than the collective of the former. That could hurt, you know, educational funding in some of our districts. Regional transportation, special education, circuit breaker level funded doesn't mean we're going to get the money we need in those areas. So while there's an increase in Chapter 70, some of that increase could be offset by essentially level funding doesn't mean level service, so there could be losses of
Never does.
service,
Very rare.
serviceability in certain of those other
now,
categories. The
we-
courts were losers in his budget. DCF was somewhat of a winner in his budget. So you'll see those shifts, but DCF has been a winner in the last couple of budgets. So that's, you know, because there's a realization.
So
that
the big
that's important.
priorities in your mind that he's focusing on are?
You know, I think, again, we're working in those margins. So I can see him focusing on transportation, which we have tried to focus on over the years. But, you know, there was a, I don't know, multi-million-dollar additional allocation to the MBTA. And the question was, well, wait a minute, that's not going to solve the problems we've seen develop. So why are we putting this money in until we know where we want that money to go? You've got a task force out there working this issue right now, looking for ways in which we can save money and ways in which we ought to invest money. Why don't we wait and see on that? Local aid was certainly a priority, 142 million, I think, in his budget, increase between Chapter 70 and unrestricted government aid. That's a good thing, and that's something that we can support, but we were in that mode anyway over the last several years. So what I'm seeing is that some of the places that are getting more money, like DCF, there are cuts that have to happen.
DCF?
Department of Children and Families. Yeah.
Just want to make sure, because
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
people,
Right. We don't talk in acronyms. Department of Children and Family, which is important. But what I think happens is when we see revenue increasing, but again, demand outpacing that revenue, sometimes losers are level funded. And where you put even a little bit of that money can have an impact on that. So as I said, the courts, which looked like they were being level funded, took a terrible beating over the course of the recession. So the money we've been trying to increase in their budgets the last several years needs to continue for them to be able to recoup. So their perspective is there's a horrible impact to what we'll be able to do. We'll be laying off substantial numbers of people over the
like
next
public
year.
defenders that already taxed beyond belief.
Well, that's a whole, I could talk to you for
Well, no,
several
but I'm just
hours
saying, I
about
mean,
that whole
you
part of
look
it.
at certain areas and you say, okay, how do you fix these things? And sometimes it really is just putting extra resources in.
Yeah, we're going to see how this progresses. You know, I want to give a full opportunity for Ways and Means to scrub through the governor's budget, we're doing that. I have my staff doing it as well to see where we see winners and losers in there, and be fair to the fact that I respect his priorities and his assessment
So
of where the money ought to be
transportation,
spent.
children are two big, I won't even call them winners, but let's just say additions.
Well, not big. Transportation was not a huge increase. We're going to have to deal with that on a longer-term basis. When the public voted last year to rescind that inflation factor, that was worth, hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 10 years, as much as potentially $2 billion, which would have been used for infrastructure improvements and repairs. We've got a serious infrastructure problem.
There's the pluses. What are the biggest minuses besides the court? And minuses could be evens.
Yeah, pretty much everything else was level funded in the budget.
So that's like a 2% cut.
We're going to see the health budget. He's showing savings within the healthcare portion of the budget that have to be realized through changes that are going to be made, redeterminations that are going to be made. I think there was some $700 million in anticipated revenue from that. He was looking at early retirements as a way in which to pick up money. So it's not so much that he cut deeply in. I think he was trying to level fund a lot of services across the board.
But John, how many
without
times
increases.
we've told people, we're level funding you. And, good Dr. Tremblay comes back and says, well, that's a 2% cut. Because inflation's going up, this is going up. And it's like, well, yeah. So if you've level funded for a number of years, eventually it's got to catch you.
Well, and not only level funding for a number of years, the recession caused us to actually make cuts. The only two areas of service that didn't see cuts during the recessionary period were Chapter 70 funding and veteran services. Everybody else took hits during the recession. So now we're dealing with trying to restore services intelligently, efficiently. Some services should not come back. And then restoring, keeping pace then with the demand that's out there.
Well, you've always said there's an inverse reaction to a recession. Unlike other businesses where your demand for product and production goes down, when you have a recession, your demand goes up disproportionately. Now that we're coming back, do you have to restore everything that you put in?
No, I think that's part of it. So we hopefully will see demand on, for instance, the unemployment accounts go down. We would hopefully see demand on some of the safety net benefit services and go down. And so those are the things you watch for, the health care, whether in fact some of the ability to redetermine people's eligibility is based upon the fact that they're back to work, they have other opportunities to secure health care, or through the connector they can get subsidized but not mass health care, what's available. So all of those things will be things that get evaluated through this process. This is sort of one of those years where we should see a steady revenue increase, but the appetite, the demand is enormous. And we just, it's going to come to the point where, look, here are our priorities. They'll come out of the House. The Senate will have a different set of priorities. We'll conference those. We'll resolve them. It'll go to the governor. Again, remember, we're working in the margins on this stuff. There are basic costs that eat up anywhere from 65 to 75 or 80% of that budget, and that there is no disagreement
So you're
on.
tweaking 20% at best.
At best, we're working in those margins. And that's why when the demands are so great, the revenues just can't sustain.
And the average layman, when you talk about, Chapter 70, and you say, well, that pays for all of our school needs, doesn't it? Or I want to talk to you a little bit about fact versus fiction on some of the impressions of, we just got 1,000 new kids sent to Milford that the state government doesn't pay us anything for. When you look at Chapter 70, how much does it, let's take a basic. Let me take a step back. Well, would you explain Chapter 70 and how we determine how much money we get of Chapter 70?
Chapter 70 is just the section of the chapter of our general laws that deals with education in all respects, not just funding, but substantively. So we have a formula that was developed, and it goes back quite a number of years. I mean, we talked about education reform in 1993. It started where the state started sending significantly more money to local communities for education. And part of the reason for that was that there was litigation pending before the Supreme Court about the equality of funding for education and whether there was really equal educational opportunity as a constitutionally mandated right in Massachusetts, whether that was protected and whether we were doing it and whether people living in poor communities were getting the same opportunity to education as people living in wealthy communities. So the state decided in 1993 to significantly increase funding, and that continued over a long period of time. The formula was really based in property valuations. In 2006, before I arrived, the year I campaigned, but during that year, the funding formula changed where funding is based upon both a factor of the wealth of a community as reported through its income taxes and a factor of the valuation of the community as reported through its assessment. So so that's how you determine how much a town will pay. How much should be spent is based on a per pupil factor of what it costs to educate a child. So there may be, let's say, we say for our region, they say it ought to cost you $8,500 to educate a kindergarten student, and $9,000 for a middle school student, and $9,500 for a high school student, and $10,000 for an English language learner, and $15,000 for a special education student, and $18,000 for a vocational student. Well, you just take those categories, you multiply them by the number of students, that's your spending. And then how much of that is the town going to spend versus how much of that is the state going to reimburse you? Go back to those factors of how much wealth do you have and what's your property value.
So you have a net school spending number to say
Exactly.
you should be spending, round numbers, 10 grand a kid at a high school.
Exactly, or 9,500.
Or 9,500.
Right.
And
If you got 300 kids, you're going to.
You got 300 times the 9,500. Here's your number.
And you do that for all the grade levels and all the students.
You get an aggregate number.
That becomes your spending target.
And then the state says, okay, Milford, you're a little more affluent than Okefenokee, so we're going to.
Less so than other towns.
And we're going to give you.
What amounts to about 47%?
47%?
47% on the ballot.
Versus some towns may be getting 77%, some may be getting.
Very little. Minimum I think is 12.5.
So you could have a very affluent town.
Yeah.
They have the same $10,000 number.
But their number is going to be higher, and that they contribute. Our number is going to be mid-range as to what we get reimbursed per student, and you're always kind of looking at the numbers from the year previously to the next for your funding for the next year. So if you have wild swings in your population, that can cause you to either get a benefit from having more kids last year than this year, or if you've got fewer kids this year than last year, if you've got more kids, then
But
you
now,
could
John, we grew up when we could go hunting, walk out of the heights, go down into the woods and go hunting. So the town population has exploded in people's minds. But is there, fact or fiction when you think of the number of students in the school in the last 40, 50 years?
Well, in the last 40, 50, it has changed. In the last 20, not dramatically. We were dealing, when I was on the school committee between 94 and 2003, I think we were dealing with a population of about 4,000 students, and we're dealing today with a population of 4,108 students. So that population's remained pretty stable, but so has our general population remained pretty stable. We're in that 27,000 range.
But again, as I mentioned, 1974, because I used the high school as my bellwether. 1974, 222 kids graduated. Go 40 years, 2014, 268. Portuguese math says that's one kid per year that we added. Doesn't seem like a big explosion here.
No, there was, back in the 60s, back in the 70s, there was an increase in population, but it's remained pretty, well, part of the reason, Al, is that our community is pretty well built out at this point. There's really not, you're not seeing, 500 building permits a year, because there really isn't that population. So you're going to deal mostly with, You know, there'll be some subdivisions now and again, but you're dealing mostly with out parcels being built upon with 1 or 2 or 3 homes that don't really change the dynamic much. So it's more about how the population turns over within a community that you see a change. And we've had a pretty, you know, pretty steady change where the population in the school system remains about the same.
Another fact or fiction. The state let in all these kids. They put them in Milford, and you're not paying us. We're all underfunded or unfunded.
You mean the English language students, the immigrant population?
Yes.
No, that's not true. The state doesn't place kids in Milford.
Immigration is not a state issue, is it?
No, in fact, you know, if anything, the state is probably the least culpable for where people live within the state. There may be students we place in Milford based on homeless issues or other kinds of issues, but you know, the federal government is the one that determines.
Statistically relevant?
No, it's not, but I'm just saying, I don't want to say there is not a child in Milford that got placed here by some state program, but not statistically relevant. And you know, the federal government is responsible for immigration, and we are responsible for, in our own community, for what you know, our housing stock looks like, what kind of jobs we offer, what kind of population comes. I mean, Milford's always been an immigrant community. That's the truth of it, whether it was the Irish, the Italians, the Portuguese, the
Brazilian, the Ecuadorian. I mean, it's all one long string.
It's what we are. And so in terms of the state's not culpable for who's here, and the vast majority of what I would call the English language learners, that's what they're called, in Milford are in our community legally, the children themselves, either having been born here or here on appropriate passports. There is a population we don't know and a population we can be sure have come here, not legally. But no matter what the status of the student, they are one of the populations, English language learners, that the state identifies through census in every community and reimburses at a higher rate than a non-population.
You hit something that's profound. My parents came here. I was born in Milford Hospital. Whether they were legal or not, which luckily they were, I'm American. I was born here. Mm-hmm. I'm a Milford kid. So the myth that all the immigrants, the vast majority, are illegals sneaking in really isn't true.
Well, you know, we have a high population in our area. We know of people who are not here in this country legally. I mean, that's a fact.
But we have a much higher population of immigrants who are legal. Your parents or grandparents, my grandfather, my mother.
My dad.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand that. But the question of where the population of students comes from is relevant to an immigration policy issue. It becomes impossible for us to deal with that when it comes to the school system. We have an obligation federally to educate children. I think we have a moral obligation to educate children.
We have a Milford obligation to take care of our kids.
We don't. I often say to people when they talk about mandates, what am I mandating that you wouldn't otherwise do? But when it comes to educating students that are in your community, your option is to not educate them, let them stay at home, and then end up on the streets doing whatever kids do on the street when they're not in school. It's not practical. You don't want an uneducated population among your community.
You're back to a fundamental issue. These are our Milford kids. I don't care they belong, who's bringing them. You know, the immigration issue to me is relevant until they land in Milford, and now they're mine.
Well, I mean, when the child is in our community, our obligation is to educate that child. It's really no more complicated or uncomplicated.
Now, the impression is kids land from Texas, and they come with no money. But what you're saying is that it's really not an accurate statement that they come and the state doesn't pay for them.
We pay the education. We pay that for that child that's in our school system designated as an English language learner. So if a child ends up in our community that has limited English skills, they get reimbursed just like every other student gets reimbursed at that 47% on the dollar.
The state's
At
paying
a
half.
higher rate, because we understand it's more expensive. My discussions with school officials suggest that there is something akin to a potential special education issue with this, in that there may be, depending upon the level of English education, the level of prior education at all, whether they're used to an education system at all, there may be additional expenses that flow from that, an enhanced cost to educating that student. And that's an important number for me, because listening to that and understanding that, I filed legislation this year to do something similar to the special education circuit breaker
Like a circuit
provision,
breaker?
which says, hey, look, if you get students into your system in the course of a fiscal year or school year that you weren't anticipating, are they above the number that you're getting general reimbursement for, or are they within that number? So for Milford, if you go from 4,000 students last year to 4,000 students this year, but there's 100 less regular ed students and 100 more ELL students, English language learners, well, you're getting some money for each of those students. Is there a delta there we should be looking at? And is there an enhanced cost to educating that child, because you need more support services that you weren't paying for with that regular ed
Well,
kid? If there is, we should be looking at a pothole account
But John,
for
you're
that.
still talking, what, 3,000 per kid difference?
Oh,
Not
not-
10,000.
Oh, no, not that, not even that much. The difference would at most be somewhere in the $750 range in terms of reimbursement.
Right. So if
per
you
student.
round the
Could
number,
be as low as a couple of $100,
but even if it was a whole $1,000 per kid
yeah.
difference, and the state reimburses half of that,
Correct.
47%.
But to the point that I'm trying to get at here, there may be enhanced services beyond that dollar figure. So if I've got to bring special services to bear because that $10,000 per student isn't enough.
But then I should educate you on, it isn't 10 for $9,500 for straight high school.
Yeah.
13,000 for what we think is ELL. Well, no, John, it's really 15.
That's important, because that gets at the formula. Is our formula even right in that regard? But there may be one-offs. There may be categories of learners that
Oh, the same as you
cost
do with
more.
special ed.
Exactly, that's my point, and that's what that's what I've been talking about with the educators in the school system. There may be categories of students. Maybe the average for us, our English language learner, is 10,000. But if you happen to have a higher number of a certain more difficult
If
population,
we got one or two kids that cost us 30 grand,
then you may,
just like SPED,
or
or
groups of kids that cost 15, not 10, and you have a higher percentage of that population in your community, then I think that ought to be recognized within our formula, and it ought to be recognized
well,
within
I
our
mean,
circuit
we're having
breaker
that
type
debate
accounts.
on a local level.
Exactly.
Is
yeah.
ELL SPED?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to me, the outcome is the same. If you don't fund it, then you're going to have less money and fewer services for the core group of kids. So one way or another, as a town, we're going to have to wrestle with. A couple years ago, the school committee came to us and needed 800 and some thousand above the normal budget, above their increase. And 650 of it was SPED and ELL. And the town stepped up and funded that as a separate issue to say they really don't have control. And yeah, I guess we're going to have to go back and teach or educate, give you the tools to say, hey, John, the number really is X, and here's the proof. Go find more money.
Yeah, I think it's fair, again, to look at it from the perspective of if you got 400 English language learner students and we think they ought to cost $10,000 a piece to educate, and we're sending you $4,700 of that per student, and you show that you're spending that $10,000 per student, but it's really costing you 12 or 13 per student on average, then that talks to our formula. If you're saying, yeah, on average, we can work with that 10,000, but when we have, 30 from this level of standard, and those really cost us $15,000, and that may only be this year, Well, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, maybe a circuit breaker program works, because
And
that
that
can
seems to have-
vary from year to year.
That seems to have worked for SPED.
It does. And so if that's an identifiable enough, determinable enough problem, then that gives me something to work with in terms of the legislation that I filed to try and address this issue.
Well, it ought to be, because, and again, I bring it down to a little microcosm, our little town of Milford. The school department is very good at identifying SPED costs. And what it was last year.
SPED's a little bit easier to identify than ELL costs. It
But
is.
I guess the incentive for them is if they really quantify it and bring it forward and can explain to us as a town, this is how many kids we served, this is what we had to do, it cost us $100 last year. This year it's costing me 110. There's our own little circuit breaker, because as a town, we've taken money out of the general account first to take care of that extra $10. So it always seems like if you give somebody an incentive, like, hey guys, really get a good grip on ELL and go teach our representatives and get all your friends in the other school districts, there's a chance, or a better chance, that you got the ammunition to go get us the money.
Well, sure. And look, there has been a push for years to take a look at the formula itself, to say, hey, look, this formula, does it still work? Are the numbers, when you tag 8,500 for a kindergarten student, is that really a fair number statewide? Or is it more than that? And of course, some of the pushback on that is, hey, look, guys, we have limited revenues. We can change the number, but that doesn't mean we're going to be able to fund it. And by the way, if we go from 8,500 to 12,500, half of that's money's going to come from you locally.
Right.
Because that's the way the formula works. So do you really want to push this button?
Move your net school spending up.
How far do you want to go? But we only get one shot at educating a child, and so it really is outcome based. We want to know that we're educating these children to certain standards, and they're capable of knowing what they need to do when they get out of any particular grade level. And so we want quality education. And I think one thing that the Milford school system's been able to do and proved itself out at is deliver quality education at a very reasonable price. So this is something we're going to follow. I mean, I am completely on board and doing everything I can to say, provide me with the information.
Well, I mean,
let me help you if I can, if the problem is identifiable as a resource problem that ought to be something the state is
I always
contributing
love when I
more
hear
to.
all the negatives about Milford school system, how terrible it is. And I sit there, your firsthand knowledge is like mine. Let's see, your son went to the other Jesuit school, right? I mean, you think about it. Your daughter went too far away, but okay. You say USC, BC. My kid, she wanted to go to Holy Cross, she got in. You look at the quality of schools, who to me are the ultimate judges of the education that Milford provides. Because if Michael didn't have a good education, he wouldn't be in BC.
No.
Your daughter.
Thank God he's not anymore, by the way.
Yeah. At $61,000 a year, you're probably happy.
Thank you.
But Liz wouldn't have had the opportunity to go all the way to USC. That to me is really the ultimate judge. Are our kids getting the opportunities to go to the schools they want to?
And I think the opportunities are out there. I think the Milford school system has always done a very good job in preparing students and addressing difficult problems. I mean, we've done a good job of handling the special education issues and being thoughtful in the way that we educate students with disabilities. We've tried to offer enrichment programs over the years before the recession hit. And as the population changes again in Milford, and we have another immigrant population, I have been very impressed with the people inside the building who put all of the politics aside, all of these issues of immigration and everything else aside, and say, I got students, I got to educate them, this is how we're going to do it.
They're Milford kids.
Well, and
End of
their
story.
goal, their view of the world is we're educating children, and here's what we need to do that. And I think the school committee, the finance committee, and I believe the Commonwealth are behind that concept. That's what we got to do. So we'll be okay with it. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with people up at the school to try and help out with
So
this.
now you've got a new appointment.
I do. Oh, you mean in terms of what I'm doing? Yes, yes. I thought it was actually with you were talking about here.
No, a real one. I mean,
Committee.
new
Yes,
committee.
Yes, I've been.
Not a minor role on a not a minor committee,
No,
right?
I've been asked to chair the Judiciary Committee, yes. It's
Pretty
a good
impressive for a
appointment. It's
Milford
good-
kid, huh?
Well, it's a good appointment. It's a good appointment. It's one I am grateful to have the opportunity to do. It's an important committee. If we get 5,000 bills filed a year, at least 800 to as many as 1,000 in various sessions get referred to that committee. Some very controversial bills, but bills that have an impact on people in the communities. And so it's, I'm grateful that the trust has been placed in me to lead that committee, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to deal with some of the issues that will come our way.
So now we've got a brand new senator coming your way.
Yes, not coming my way, here.
Here. Different?
Oh yeah, of course. We all are, right? I mean, that's what happens. But, you know, he's hit the ground. We've been working together on a couple of issues. In fact, today we had a meeting on 2 different issues. Toured a facility, the old National Guard facility, met with some folks up there, and also working on an unemployment issue together. And we've been collaborating. You know, I told you the story. Catherine Coyne told me, you know, when the bell rings, the contest is over, people expect one thing out of you, and that's to go work together. Yep. And that's what I intend to do. Ryan's indicated the same thing, and I'm sure that we'll continue to work together in the best interest of the people we represent.
Well, I mean, you know, way early in this program you mentioned the word respect, and I think that's, if anything, what seems underwhelming when we hear from Washington is the lack of respect that different members of the Congress have. You know, I don't understand whether you're red, blue, or purple, why you can't do a Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan thing. I may not agree with you, but I'll respect your position and work with you.
Well, you know, I like to think that all of us recognize the problems. You know, we may disagree on the priority of problems like we were talking about before. The devil is in the solutions. The differences of opinion are often more about the solutions than the problems themselves. The national level, we know the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon is a problem. The Republicans, Democrats will agree and tell you that. The question is, what's the solution? We can tell you on a local level that we have a problem with our healthcare spending. Nobody's going to disagree with that. We have a problem with our transportation system. Nobody's going to disagree with that. We're going to disagree on the solutions and how do we get at those solutions. And so the obligation we have, and I've always taken the tact and believe in, is we sit down, we compromise, we listen, we find common ground that we can find, and find the solutions inside that. So you don't get one extreme or the other very often. And look, that's the way this system was built by the people who started it. There's a redundancy in all of this that is built upon the concept of compromise and coming up with solutions. It seems as though what you mentioned in terms of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill has just been lost on current Washington. It's not lost in Boston. That's not the case. Brad Jones, the Republican leader, look, there are extremists in both parties that don't want to talk to the extremists in the other party and don't want any compromise.
But John, the far left scares me as much as the far right.
Or vice versa for you.
But you know, you turn around and you say, anybody that's spouting dogma
Yeah.
over practicality just isn't looking for a solution.
Well, and it's not so much what you say you believe in as how far are you willing to come to find a solution. Because if the problem goes on and on and on, because you won't come to the table to work with people to find a majority that will work a solution, we're not going anywhere. The problem's not going to get solved. And all the work that I've done in the legislature has been designed to do that. Every piece of legislation that I've been successful in getting passed, and there have been some pretty significant pieces of legislation that, you know, I've helped to bring compromise to that weren't getting compromised before. It's about that tact, which is don't stop working to find common
if they
ground.
believed, I wouldn't say you're ultra blue or ultra red, because if they believed you were on either extreme, they wouldn't have asked you to be a chair of a judiciary committee, which you're almost forced to work with everybody, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I said that to a reporter who called me. He said, well, you know, you've been sort of on the very conservative side on the immigration issue. I said, look, as the chair of a committee, my obligation is to step my own opinions back and my own personal preferences back when it comes to dealing with the legislation that's before the committee. When I have my own legislation I may have filed, yeah, I'm going to be as aggressive on that legislation as I believe I should be. But when I'm chairing a committee, my obligation is to listen to other members of that committee, listen to advocates, listen, listen, listen. And if I think the problem has a solution somewhere in the people who are talking to me, my job is to try and bring those people together, not impose my own opinion on them, and see if we can come to a conclusion that'll get a solution. And that's what we'll do. And actually, you know, over the last several years, somebody said to me, well, that's a really rough position, the legislation before it. I said, I want to tell you something. Over the last half a dozen years, we've solved a lot of those problems. We took care of the transgender issue. We took care of the, you know, the sexual assault statute of limitations issue. We took care of the alimony issue. We took care of a number of issues over the last several years that were really hot button issues. Such that, yeah, there'll be controversies this year, but we have a pattern of knowing how to solve those problems. And we'll continue to do it. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun. It's a lot of work, but it's going to be fun.
Well, and on that, we hope you stay a long time. Jennifer, please let John come out and play for many more years.
Well, let's not go too many years here.
Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And as always, the most important thing you can do is get out and vote. Get to learn the people who you have a choice in, how they represent you, what they stand for, and yeah, I'll go out on a limb. Get to know the people that really care about Milford and represent Milford, and I frankly don't care about somebody from some square state trying to change my opinion, because Milford isn't a square state. So for those people who put poo in my mailbox, I'm not overly impressed, and it's not going to change my mind. But as always, to our 6 loyal viewers, thank you for watching. May God bless, and may tomorrow be a better day than today. Thanks, John.
Thank you.